It was one of those perfect Sunday afternoons when everything just felt right. The sun was shining, the roads were clear, and David Williams was enjoying the smooth ride in his brand-new black sedan. He'd worked hard for this moment, building his business from the ground up over 15 years. This car wasn't just a vehicle to him. It represented every early morning, every late night, and every sacrifice he'd made to get where he was today. David turned onto Maple Street, one of the nicer neighborhoods in town. He was heading home after checking on his newest dealership location. The streets were quiet, with only a few joggers and dog walkers enjoying their Sunday. He had his favorite jazz playing softly on the radio, his window cracked just enough to let in the spring breeze. Life was good. Then he saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. David's heart sank a little, but he stayed calm. He hadn't been speeding. He'd used his turn signal. His registration was current, his insurance was paid. There was no reason for this stop, but he knew better than to panic. He'd been through situations like this before. Too many times, if he was being honest. He pulled over slowly and carefully, making sure to put on his hazard lights. He placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, right where the officer could see them. His father had taught him this when he was 16. "Son," his dad had said, "when you get pulled over, you make sure your hands are visible. You stay calm. You speak respectfully. You do everything right, even when they do everything wrong." The officer took his time getting out of the patrol car. David watched in his side mirror as the man adjusted his belt and put on his hat. When the officer finally approached, David could see the nameplate. Officer D. Hayes. The man was in his late 40s, with a stern face that didn't show any warmth or friendliness. "License and registration," Hayes said, not bothering with any greeting. His hand rested on his gun holster, which immediately put David on edge. "Good afternoon, officer," David said politely. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" "Just give me your license and registration," Hayes repeated, his tone sharp and impatient. David moved slowly, narrating his actions. "I'm reaching for my wallet in my back pocket now." He pulled out his wallet carefully. "And now I'm opening my glove compartment for the registration." Officer Hayes snatched the documents from David's hand and barely glanced at them before asking, "Whose car is this?" "It's mine, sir," David answered calmly. Hayes looked at David, then at the luxury car, then back at David. His expression said everything his words hadn't yet. "This is your car?" he asked with obvious disbelief in his voice. "Yes, sir, it is." "Uh-huh," Hayes said, walking around the vehicle slowly, examining it like he was looking for evidence at a crime scene. "This is a $70,000 car. You're telling me you own this?" David felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice steady. "Yes, officer. I own this car. The registration should show that." Hayes came back to the window, holding the registration paper up like it was suspicious. "Where do you work?" "I own several car dealerships in the area," David said. "Williams Premium Auto Group," Officer Hayes laughed. Actually laughed. "Right, and I'm the mayor," he said sarcastically. "Step out of the vehicle, please." "Officer, can you tell me what I did wrong?" "Why did you pull me over?" "Step out of the vehicle now." Hayes's hand moved closer to his gun. David's mind raced. He knew his rights, but he also knew that exercising them could be dangerous. He'd seen too many news stories that started just like this. Slowly, he opened his door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible. "Turn around. Hands on the car," Hayes ordered. David complied, placing his palms flat on the roof of his car. He could feel people starting to watch. A woman walking her dog had stopped on the sidewalk. A couple washing their car in a nearby driveway had paused to look. David felt the heat of embarrassment creeping up his neck, but beneath that was something stronger. Anger. Controlled, quiet anger at being treated like a criminal for absolutely no reason. Officer Hayes patted him down roughly, checking his pockets. "So let me get this straight," Hayes said as he searched. "You expect me to believe that you, driving through this neighborhood on a Sunday afternoon in a brand new luxury sedan, just happen to own car dealerships?" "It's the truth," David said, staring straight ahead at his car. "You got any proof of that? Business cards?"
"Anything that actually proves you own these so-called dealerships?"
"My business cards are in my wallet, which you're holding," David said. Hayes pulled out David's wallet and flipped through it carelessly, pulling out business cards and dropping them on the ground. When he found David's business card that clearly stated David Williams, owner and CEO, Williams Premium Auto Group, He studied it with suspicion. Anyone can print cards, Hayes said dismissively. This doesn't prove anything. A small crowd was forming now. David could hear whispers. He saw phones being pulled out, people starting to record. Part of him was grateful for that. These videos had saved lives, had told the truth when officers wouldn't. Officer Hayes, my registration clearly matches my license. The car isn't stolen. I haven't broken any laws. Why am I being detained? I'll decide if you've broken any laws, Hayes snapped back. Something doesn't add up here. This car, this neighborhood, your story. I've been doing this job for 20 years and I know when something's not right. What Hayes really meant was clear to David, even if the officer wouldn't say it out loud. What didn't add up was seeing a black man in an expensive car in a wealthy neighborhood. That was the crime Officer Hayes was really investigating. Not theft, not any actual violation of the law, just the crime of not fitting Hayes's narrow view of who belonged where. I'm calling for backup, Hayes said, walking back to his patrol car. Don't you move. David stood there, hand still on his car, feeling the eyes of strangers on him. The spring breeze that had felt so nice minutes ago now felt cold. His jazz music was still playing from inside the car, a strange soundtrack to this nightmare. He thought about his wife, about his 3 kids, about the employees who depended on him, about the life he'd built. And here he was, being treated like a criminal on a sunny Sunday afternoon for the crime of driving while black. This was going to be a long day. David could feel it. But he also knew something Officer Hayes didn't. The truth always comes out eventually. And when it did, Hayes was going to regret ever turning on those flashing lights. The wait felt endless. David stood by his car, watching Officer Hayes sit in his patrol vehicle, probably running his license through every system he could think of. The small crowd that had gathered was growing. More people were stopping, more phones were out recording. David could hear their whispered conversations. What did he do? I don't know, just pulled him over. That's David Williams. He owns those car dealerships. Are you serious? Why is he being treated like this? 2 more patrol cars pulled up within 10 minutes, their lights flashing and creating a scene that made everything feel more dramatic than it needed to be. David's simple traffic stop now looked like the arrest of a dangerous criminal. Neighbors were coming out of their houses. Cars were slowing down to see what was happening. Officer Hayes got out of his car with a satisfied look on his face, like he'd found exactly what he was looking for. But when he approached David again, his expression showed frustration. Everything's coming back clean, Hayes admitted, though he said it like he didn't believe his own computer. But I still think something's off here. One of the backup officers, a younger man who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation, stepped forward. Hayes, if everything's checking out, maybe we should... I'll handle this, Rodriguez. Hayes cut him off sharply. I want to search the vehicle. David's heart started pounding harder. Officer, you don't have probable cause to search my car. I haven't committed any crime. I don't consent to a search. Refusing a search? Hayes said loudly, making sure everyone around could hear. Now, why would an innocent man refuse a search? What are you hiding? I'm not hiding anything. I'm exercising my constitutional rights, David said, keeping his voice calm even though he wanted to shout. This was exactly the kind of trap he'd been afraid of. Say yes, and they tear through your property looking for any excuse to arrest you. Say no, and they use your refusal as evidence of guilt. Hayes moved closer, invading David's personal space. Here's what I think. I think this car is stolen. I think these documents are forged. And I think you're running some kind of scam, so I'm searching this vehicle for evidence. You can't do that without a warrant or probable cause, David protested. I have reasonable suspicion, Hayes said, already moving toward the car. That's all I need. David wanted to physically stop him, but knew that would give Hayes exactly the excuse he was looking for. Instead, he said clearly, for all the recording phones to hear, I do not consent to this search. This is an illegal search. Hayes ignored him completely. He opened the driver's side door and started going through everything. The glove compartment was emptied onto the ground. Papers, napkins, charging cables, all tossed out carelessly. He pulled out the floor mats, checked under the seats, opened the center console. David's personal belongings were being scattered across the street like trash. His gym bag was dumped out, showing his workout clothes and sneakers. A gift bag with a present for his daughter's upcoming birthday was opened and examined. Hayes even found David's lunch from earlier, a half-eaten sandwich in a container, and looked at it suspiciously before throwing it aside. This is humiliating, David said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. An elderly woman from the crowd spoke up. Officer, this seems excessive. The man said it's his car. Why are you doing this? Hayes spun around. Ma'am, step back. This is police business. It's a public street, she replied firmly, and I have a right to observe. The other officers looked increasingly uncomfortable. The younger one, Rodriguez, approached Hayes again. Come on, man. We're not finding anything. The registration matches. His license is valid. We should wrap this up. But Hayes was too deep into his theory now to back out. He'd committed to the idea that David was a criminal, and admitting he was wrong would mean admitting he'd just humiliated an innocent man in front of dozens of witnesses. Pop the trunk, Hayes demanded. Officer Hayes, please. This is my personal vehicle. You have no right. Pop the trunk or I'll arrest you for obstruction. David reluctantly hit the trunk release button. Hayes immediately went through it, moving the emergency kit, the spare tire, everything. He found David's golf clubs from a game last week and examined each one like they might be weapons. He found a box of promotional materials from the dealership, flyers and brochures, and barely glanced at them even though they clearly showed David's face and title. The crowd was getting larger and more vocal. People were recording from every angle. Someone had even set up what looked like a live stream on their phone. David could hear bits of commentary. This is racial profiling straight up. That's definitely David Williams. My cousin bought a car from him. This is disgusting. That officer should be ashamed. Hayes seemed to feed off the attention like he needed to justify his actions even more now. I'm going to need to take you downtown for questioning, he announced. On what charge? David asked, his voice finally showing his frustration. Suspicion of vehicle theft. You just ran the plates. You know the car isn't stolen. Suspicion of identity fraud, then. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. Hayes was literally making up charges as he went, trying to find anything that would stick. The officer pulled out his handcuffs, and that's when David's wife pulled up. Victoria Williams jumped out of her car in her scrubs, still wearing her hospital badge. She was a respected surgeon who'd just finished a shift, and she looked both terrified and furious. What is going on here? She demanded, rushing over to David. David, are you okay? Ma'am, step back, Hayes ordered. I will not step back. That's my husband. Why is he being detained? Hayes looked at Victoria with the same suspicion he'd shown David. And who are you? I'm Dr. Victoria Williams. I'm his wife. Now someone better tell me why my husband is being treated like a criminal. Your husband is suspected of vehicle theft and fraud, Hayes said, as if he'd actually found evidence of these things. Victoria looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Vehicle theft? That's our car. We bought it 3 weeks ago. From our own dealership. Sure you did, Hayes said with a smirk. Let me guess, you're both successful business owners living the dream, right? Actually, yes, Victoria said firmly. David owns Williams Premium Auto Group, 3 locations. Been in business for 15 years. I'm a cardiac surgeon at Memorial Hospital. We pay our taxes, we contribute to this community, and we have every right to drive on this street without being harassed. She pulled out her phone and started making calls, first to their lawyer, speaking quickly and urgently about what was happening, then to someone else, though Hayes wasn't paying attention to that second call. He was too busy trying to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly slipping away from him. The crowd had grown to at least 50 people now. The incident was trending on social media. News vans were starting to arrive, their satellite dishes rising into the air. What had started as a simple traffic stop had turned into a public spectacle, and Officer Hayes, too proud or too stubborn to admit his mistake, was preparing to make things even worse. Officer Hayes wasn't backing down. If anything, Victoria's arrival seemed to make him more determined to prove he was right. He looked at both of them standing together, and David could practically see the wheels turning in his head, creating a new narrative to justify his actions. So you're both in on this together, Hayes said, nodding like he'd just solved a complex puzzle. That's how these scams usually work. Couples working together, forged documents, stolen identities. Victoria looked at him in disbelief. Are you hearing yourself right now? Do you realize how ridiculous you sound? Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down. Don't tell me to calm down. You've torn apart our car, humiliated my husband in public, and now you're accusing us both of being criminals with absolutely no evidence. David put a gentle hand on Victoria's arm. He knew from experience that showing any emotion, any anger, would only be used against them. They had to stay calm even when everything in them wanted to scream at the injustice of it all. Hayes walked back to his patrol car and got on his radio. David and Victoria could hear him talking to dispatch, asking them to run the vehicle identification number again, checking for any warrants, any flags in the system. He was searching desperately for anything that would validate his suspicions. The third officer who'd arrived, an older woman with sergeant stripes, finally spoke up. "Hayes, I've been looking at these documents. The registration clearly shows this vehicle belongs to David Williams. The address matches his license. Everything is in order." Hayes came back over and David saw something dangerous in his eyes. It was the look of a man who'd gone too far to turn back now. "These documents could be forgeries," he insisted. "High-quality fakes. I've seen it before, have you?" the sergeant asked, her tone suggesting she didn't believe him. "The VIN could be cloned from a legitimate vehicle," Hayes continued, ignoring her skepticism. "They steal a car, then create fake paperwork using a real VIN from a different vehicle. It's sophisticated fraud." David had heard enough. "Officer, you're inventing scenarios to justify an illegal stop. I've been cooperative. I've answered your questions. My documentation is legitimate. You have no probable cause to detain me further." "I'll determine what probable cause is," Hayes shot back. "And right now I'm looking at a very expensive car. 2 people with a story that seems too convenient and a lot of attitude for someone who claims to be innocent." "Attitude?" Victoria said incredulously. "You mean the attitude of people who know their rights and refuse to be treated like criminals?" A man from the crowd shouted, "Check the registration again. It says Williams Premium Auto Group right on it." Hayes spun around. "Everyone needs to back up and mind their own business, or I'll start arresting people for interfering with police business." But the crowd wasn't intimidating easily. One person shouted, "We're recording everything." Another said, "This is racial profiling." A teenager yelled, "This is going viral, officer. The whole world is watching." Officer Rodriguez, the younger cop who'd been uncomfortable from the start, pulled Hayes aside. David couldn't hear everything they were saying, but he caught fragments. "This is getting out of control. The registration clearly matches. We're going to be on the news. Let it go, man." But Hayes shook his head firmly, refusing whatever advice Rodriguez was trying to give. He came back to David and Victoria with renewed determination. "I'm taking both of you downtown for questioning. If your story checks out, you'll be released. If it doesn't, you'll be charged accordingly." "Charged with what?" David demanded. "What specific law have we broken?" "Suspicion of identity theft, vehicle theft, and possession of forged documents." Victoria pulled out her hospital ID badge, her driver's license, and her credit cards. "Look at these. Look at my face. Look at my name. Everything matches. How are you going to claim I'm using a stolen identity when I have years of documentation proving who I am?" Hayes barely glanced at her credentials. "Identity theft rings are sophisticated. They can create entire false histories." David realized with growing horror that nothing they said or showed would matter. Hayes had decided they were guilty, and he was going to find a way to make that narrative stick, evidence be damned. This wasn't about facts anymore. It was about a police officer who couldn't admit he was wrong, especially not in front of this many witnesses. The sergeant stepped forward again. "Hayes, I really think we need to reconsider this approach. We have no actual evidence of any crime. The department is going to have questions about this stop." "Then they can ask me downtown," Hayes replied stubbornly, "after I've properly investigated these 2. David's lawyer, Anthony Chen, arrived at that moment, parking quickly and rushing over with his briefcase. Anthony was a sharp attorney who'd handled cases for David's business for years. He took one look at the scene and immediately understood what was happening. "Don't say another word," Anthony told David and Victoria. Then he turned to Hayes. "I'm Anthony Chen, attorney for David and Victoria Williams. Are my clients under arrest?" "They're being detained for questioning." "On what charges?" Hayes repeated his list of suspicions, and Anthony actually laughed. "Suspicions? You're detaining them on suspicions? Do you have any actual evidence? Any proof whatsoever?" "I have reasonable suspicion that..." "Reasonable suspicion requires specific, articulable facts. Not hunches, not assumptions, facts. Can you provide those facts?" Hayes fumbled for a moment. "The expensive vehicle, the neighborhood, the expensive vehicle that's properly registered to my client, the neighborhood that any citizen has the right to drive through." "What else?" "Their attitude when questioned." Anthony smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. So let me get this straight. You pulled over a black couple in an expensive car, found all their paperwork in order, found no evidence of any crime, but you're detaining them anyway because they had the audacity to question why they were being stopped. The sergeant actually groaned. Officer Rodriguez looked away, shaking his head. Even Hayes seemed to realize how bad this sounded when someone spelled it out so clearly, but he was in too deep now. His pride wouldn't let him walk away. I'm well within my rights to investigate suspicious circumstances, and I'm well within my rights to file a lawsuit for false arrest, violation of civil rights, and harassment, Anthony countered. In fact, I'm going to do exactly that. But first, you're going to release my clients immediately, or you're going to arrest them and charge them with specific crimes. Which is it going to be, officer? The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what Hayes would do next. The news cameras had arrived and were filming everything. Social media was exploding with the story, and David Williams stood there surrounded by his scattered belongings, wondering how a simple drive home had turned into this nightmare. Captain Rodriguez wasn't finished. She turned to the sergeant and the remaining officers. I want body camera footage from everyone on scene. I want dashcam footage. I want written reports from each of you by end of shift tomorrow. And I want them detailed. Everything that happened, everything that was said, every decision that was made. The officers nodded, some looking relieved that leadership was taking charge, others looking worried about what those reports might mean for their careers if they hadn't done enough to stop Hayes. The captain then addressed the crowd. I know many of you have been recording this incident. I'm going to ask that if you're willing, please send those videos to the department. They'll be valuable evidence in the investigation. And if any of you want to file formal complaints or witness statements, we'll have officers here to take those. Several people called out that they'd be happy to provide their videos. The news reporters were already planning their evening broadcasts. This story was going to dominate local news, probably even make national headlines. Anthony Chen pulled David aside. We need to talk about next steps. This isn't over just because Hayes has been suspended. You have grounds for a civil rights lawsuit, both against Hayes personally and against the department. David nodded slowly, still processing everything that had happened. I know, but Anthony, this isn't just about me anymore. Did you hear those people? This has happened before. How many times? How many people didn't have witnesses or cameras or a lawyer who could show up in 20 minutes? That's exactly why we need to pursue this, Anthony agreed. Because you have the platform and resources to fight back. You can force changes that will protect other people from going through what you just went through. Victoria joined them, wrapping her arm around David's waist. Are you okay? She asked softly. No, he admitted. I'm angry, I'm hurt, and I'm exhausted. But I'm also thinking about everyone who's experienced this without anyone believing them. At least I have proof. At least people saw it happen. James came over with more documentation. Mr. Williams, I brought the original purchase agreement for your vehicle. The financing documents, everything. Although it seems like the captain already knows who you are. She does, David confirmed. We've met at several community events. The irony is that I've worked hard to build relationships with law enforcement. I've sponsored police youth programs. I've donated vehicles for community policing initiatives. And still, none of that protected me from being profiled today. Captain Rodriguez approached them again. Mr. Williams, I want you to know that I'm treating this with the utmost seriousness. Officer Hayes will face a full disciplinary hearing. His personnel file is being reviewed as we speak. And based on what I'm hearing about previous incidents, I expect there will be significant consequences. Captain, with all due respect, I've heard similar promises before, David said. How many complaints has Hayes had filed against him over the years? She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I'm not at liberty to discuss another officer's personnel file. That's what I thought. Which means there probably were complaints, but nothing was done about them until today, when it happened to someone with enough resources and visibility to make it a problem for the department. Captain Rodriguez couldn't argue with that. You're right. And that's part of what needs to change. We need better accountability systems, better oversight, better training. You need to believe black people when they tell you they've been profiled, Victoria said firmly. Because I guarantee you that every complaint filed against Hayes was legitimate. But it was easier to dismiss them than to address the real problem. One of the people who'd come forward earlier, the lawyer who said Hayes had stopped him 2 years ago, introduced himself. Robert Chen. I'm an attorney with the civil rights law firm downtown. Mr. Williams, I want to help with your case. And I think we need to look into a pattern and practice investigation of the entire department. Captain Rodriguez's expression tightened at that suggestion, but she didn't object. She knew that with this much public attention, with this much video evidence, there would be scrutiny whether she wanted it or not. The news reporter, Jennifer Park, was wrapping up her live broadcast. To recap this developing story, prominent local businessman David Williams was pulled over and detained for over 90 minutes, accused of stealing his own vehicle, despite having proper documentation. Officer Derek Hayes, a 20-year veteran, has been suspended pending investigation. Multiple community members have come forward claiming similar experiences with the same officer. We'll continue to follow this story as it develops. Back to you in the studio. As people started to leave, many stopped to shake David's hand or offer words of support. An elderly man said, "Thank you for standing up. My grandson was stopped last month and I didn't know what to do. Now I do." A young woman told him, "I work 2 jobs to afford my car and I'm terrified every time I see police lights. Today gave me hope that maybe things can change." These conversations reminded David why this mattered so much. It wasn't just about him. It was about every black person who'd been made to feel like they didn't belong, like their success was somehow suspicious, like they were guilty until proven innocent. Officer Rodriguez. The young cop approached David one more time before leaving. "Sir, I know I already apologized, but I want you to know that what I witnessed today changed my perspective. I thought I understood racial profiling in theory, but seeing it happen, seeing how Hayes treated you despite clear evidence of your innocence, it opened my eyes. I'm going to be better. I'm going to speak up when I see this happening." David appreciated the sincerity in his voice. "I hope you mean that. Because good officers staying silent is how bad officers get away with this behavior for years. I understand that now, and I'm sorry it took your experience for me to really get it." As the scene finally began to clear, David looked at his car, now put back together but somehow feeling violated. He'd have to drive it home, sit in the same seat where he'd been pulled from, touch the same steering wheel that Hayes had grabbed with suspicion. Victoria seemed to read his mind. "We can come back for the car tomorrow. Let James drive it home. We'll take my car." David considered it but shook his head. "No, I'm not going to let Hayes take away my joy in this car. I'm not going to let him make me afraid to drive in my own city. That gives him too much power." Anthony was taking notes on his phone, already building the case. "David, I'm going to need you to write down everything you remember while it's fresh. Every word Hayes said, every action he took, your emotional state throughout. It's all relevant." "I don't think I'll ever forget a single moment," David said quietly. Captain Rodriguez gave David her direct phone number. "If you need anything, if you have questions about the investigation, you call me directly. Don't go through the regular channels. I want to make sure this is handled properly." It was a gesture and David appreciated it, but he also knew that one sympathetic captain couldn't fix a broken system. Real change would require more than good intentions. It would require policy changes, accountability measures, community oversight, and a fundamental shift in how officers were trained to see and treat black citizens. As David finally got into his car to drive home, with Victoria following in her vehicle and James leading the way, he felt the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. He was exhausted, emotionally drained, and still angry. But he was also determined. This wouldn't be the end of the story. This would be the beginning of the fight for change. Because if David Williams, with all his success and community connections, could be treated like a criminal, then every black person in the city was at risk. And that was unacceptable. The sun had fully set now, and as David drove through the streets of the city he'd called home for 40 years, he wondered how many other people had driven these same streets feeling afraid, feeling targeted, feeling like they didn't belong. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight he just wanted to go home, hug his kids, and try to process the trauma of being treated like a criminal in his own community. The fight for justice could wait until morning. But it would come. David would make sure of that. More dealership employees kept arriving. It seemed like half the staff had dropped everything to come support their boss. They brought file folders, printed documents, photos, and even a framed magazine article from last year's Top 50 Business Leaders issue, featuring David on the cover. Lisa, The young employee who'd first shown the tablet was particularly upset. Mr. Williams gave me a chance when nobody else would, she told anyone who would listen. I was a single mom with no college degree, and he hired me. He paid for my training. He promoted me. And now some officer is treating him like a criminal? This is wrong. Other employees shared similar stories. David had a reputation for hiring people who needed second chances. Former military veterans, people who'd made mistakes in their past. Young people from tough neighborhoods. He believed in giving opportunities, and his staff was fiercely loyal because of it. James was still on the phone with someone from the police department, and his expression was getting more serious by the minute. Yes, Captain. We have approximately 60 witnesses, multiple video recordings, 3 news stations on scene. This is a PR nightmare waiting to happen. I suggest you get here quickly. Officer Hayes was starting to look less confident and more nervous. The arrival of so many people vouching for David, the documentation, the media attention, it was all adding up to a very bad situation for him. But he still couldn't bring himself to simply apologize and walk away. Even if he does own these dealerships, Hayes said, speaking more quietly now, that doesn't mean this particular vehicle wasn't obtained illegally. Maybe he's running a front, money laundering, something. Anthony Chen overheard this and actually laughed out loud. Now it's money laundering? Officer, you're throwing accusations around like confetti, hoping something will stick. But here's what's actually happening. You pulled over a successful black businessman, couldn't believe he earned his success honestly, and now you're inventing crimes to justify your prejudice. The sergeant looked pained. Hayes, please stop talking. But Hayes wasn't done. I'm a 20-year veteran of this department. I've made thousands of legitimate stops. My record speaks for itself, does it? Said a voice from the crowd. A man stepped forward, someone David didn't recognize. Because you pulled me over 2 years ago for the exact same reason. Accused me of stealing my own car. I'm a lawyer and I'm black, and you didn't believe I could afford my vehicle either. I filed a complaint, but nothing came of it. Another person spoke up. You stopped my son last year. He was driving home from college in a car we bought him. You searched it illegally just like you did to Mr. Williams. A woman raised her hand. My husband. Same thing. You seem to have a pattern, Officer Hayes. Hayes looked genuinely shocked that these people were coming forward. He'd probably forgotten most of these stops, just routine parts of his day. But these people had never forgotten. When you're the victim of racial profiling, you remember every detail. The sergeant's face had gone pale. I'm going to need all of you to provide statements, she said to the people who'd come forward. This is information that needs to be documented. Jennifer Park, the news reporter, was recording all of this. So there appears to be a pattern of behavior here, she said into her microphone. Multiple people claiming they've been stopped by Officer Hayes under similar circumstances. A police captain's car pulled up, and a woman in uniform stepped out. Captain Elena Rodriguez was known in the community as a fair and no-nonsense leader. She'd worked her way up through the ranks and had a reputation for holding officers accountable. The look on her face as she took in the scene suggested she was not happy. Someone want to explain to me why I'm seeing this situation trending on social media before anyone from my department called me, she said, her voice sharp. The sergeant stepped forward. Captain, Officer Hayes initiated a traffic stop that has escalated significantly. I can see that. Sergeant. Captain Rodriguez looked at the crowd, the news cameras, the scattered belongings that were still being picked up, and finally at David Williams. Her expression changed immediately. Mr. Williams? Is that you? David straightened up. Yes, Captain. She walked over quickly, and to everyone's surprise, she extended her hand. Captain Rodriguez, we met at the Chamber of Commerce breakfast last month. You spoke about hiring practices and community investment. David shook her hand, relief washing over him. Finally, someone who could confirm his identity and end this nightmare. I remember. You were asking about our youth apprenticeship program. That's right. She turned to Hayes, and her expression hardened. Officer Hayes, did you pull over David Williams? I pulled over a vehicle that appeared suspicious, Hayes said. But his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Suspicious how? The expensive vehicle, the neighborhood, Stop right there, Captain Rodriguez cut him off. David Williams owns 3 car dealerships in this city. He's a respected business owner. He serves on multiple community boards. I've been to the opening of his newest location. Are you telling me you didn't know who he was? I'd never seen him before, Hayes admitted. So you saw a black man in an expensive car and assumed it was stolen? That's not what That's exactly what you did. Captain Rodriguez looked at the sergeant. Tell me you at least verified the registration? It's valid. Everything checks out. Vehicle belongs to Mr. Williams. Registration matches his license, no warrants, no flags, nothing. The captain closed her eyes briefly like she was fighting off a headache. When she opened them, she looked at David. Mr. Williams, on behalf of the department, I sincerely apologize for this incident. This should never have happened. Apologies don't fix humiliation, Captain, David said quietly. Every person here watched me be treated like a criminal. My belongings were thrown on the ground. I was accused of theft, fraud, and money laundering, all for the crime of driving while black. Captain Rodriguez nodded slowly. You're absolutely right. And this is going to be addressed. Officer Hayes, you're suspended from duty effective immediately pending a full investigation. What? Hayes looked genuinely shocked. Captain, you can't. I absolutely can, and I am. Give me your badge and service weapon. Now. Hayes's face went through several emotions. Shock, anger, disbelief, and finally fear. Captain, please. I was doing my job. I was trying to investigate. You were racially profiling, and we both know it, she said firmly. Badge and weapon. Don't make me ask again. Reluctantly, Hayes unclipped his badge and handed it over, then removed his service weapon and gave it to the captain. He looked smaller somehow, diminished without those symbols of authority. James stepped forward. Captain, we have several other individuals here who claim they've been stopped by Officer Hayes under similar circumstances. They're willing to give statements. Captain Rodriguez looked at the people who'd come forward, and her expression grew even more serious. Then we're going to take those statements. This isn't just about today. If there's a pattern of behavior, we need to know about it. Officer Rodriguez, the young cop who'd been uncomfortable from the start, approached David. Mr. Williams, I want you to know that most of us aren't like Hayes. What he did today, it's not okay. It's not what we're trained to do. And it's not what this badge is supposed to represent. David appreciated the sentiment, but he was too exhausted to be reassuring. Then make sure your fellow officers know that. Because if you stay silent when you see this happening, you're part of the problem too. The young officer nodded, accepting the criticism. You're right. I should have done more to stop this earlier. I'm sorry. Victoria had been quiet for a while, but now she spoke up, her voice shaking with emotion. Do you know what it's like? To work hard, to follow every rule, to build something from nothing and still be treated like you don't belong? David and I have devoted our lives to this community. We employ people. We pay taxes. We donate to charities. And one officer can destroy our dignity in minutes because he looked at my husband and saw a criminal instead of a human being. The crowd broke into applause and several people shouted their agreement. The news cameras captured every moment, every emotion, every powerful word. Captain Rodriguez addressed the crowd. What happened here today is unacceptable, and it's going to be thoroughly investigated. Anyone who has information or who wants to file a formal complaint, please come forward. We're going to make this right. But David knew that making it right was more complicated than one suspension or one investigation. This was bigger than Officer Hayes. This was about a system that allowed these stops to happen over and over again. It was about the assumptions and biases that led an officer to see a black man in a nice car and immediately think criminal instead of successful businessman. As the sun began to set, on what had been a perfect Sunday afternoon turned nightmare, David Williams stood surrounded by his employees, his wife, his lawyer, and a community that had witnessed an injustice. The question now was whether anyone would actually do something about it. David barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Officer Hayes's face, felt the humiliation of having his belongings thrown on the ground, heard the accusations being thrown at him. Victoria held him, both of them processing the trauma in their own ways. By Monday morning, the story had exploded. It wasn't just local news anymore. National outlets had picked it up. Prominent businessman racially profiled, read one headline. Officer suspended after viral video shows illegal stop, said another. The hashtag #Justice for David was trending on social media, with thousands sharing their own stories of being profiled. David's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted interviews. Civil rights organizations wanted to help. Other victims of police misconduct were reaching out, sharing their stories. It was overwhelming, but it also showed him how widespread the problem was. At the dealership, business was actually booming. People were coming in specifically to support David, to buy cars from a man who'd been treated so unjustly. "If the police think you're too successful," one customer told him, "then you must be doing something right. I want to support your business." But not everyone was supportive. David started receiving hate mail and threatening messages. "You're making this about race when it's not," some people wrote. "You're just trying to get attention." That officer was doing his job. The messages revealed just how many people couldn't or wouldn't see the obvious racial bias in what had happened. James called an employee, meeting at the main dealership location. Over 100 staff members crowded into the showroom, and David stood before them feeling both grateful and uncomfortable with all the attention. "I want to thank everyone who came to support me yesterday," David began. "You didn't have to do that. You could have stayed home, stayed out of it. But you showed up, and that meant everything to me and Victoria." The employees applauded, several wiping away tears. Lisa, the young woman who'd brought the tablet, spoke up. "Mr. Williams, you've always had our backs. Of course we're going to have yours. What happened to you was wrong, and we all saw it." Another employee raised his hand. "Boss, what can we do? How can we help?" David had been thinking about that question all night. "Keep sharing the video. Keep telling the story. Don't let people forget what happened. Because this isn't just about me. This is about every person who looks like me and has been through something similar. We need to turn this moment into momentum for real change." Meanwhile, the police department was in crisis mode. Captain Rodriguez had discovered that Officer Hayes had 14 previous complaints filed against him over his 20-year career. 14. And none of them had resulted in significant discipline. Most had been dismissed with minimal investigation. The pattern was clear and damning. The department's Internal Affairs Division, under intense public pressure, launched a comprehensive review. They found that Hayes had disproportionately stopped black drivers in upscale neighborhoods. His written reports often used phrases like "looked suspicious" or "seemed nervous" without specific details. And in several cases, like with Robert Chen, the complaints had been filed but never properly investigated. By Wednesday, the police union released a statement defending Hayes, claiming he'd been unfairly targeted and that the suspension was premature. This outraged the community even more. How could they defend an officer with such a clear pattern of racial profiling? The mayor, feeling the political pressure, called an emergency town hall meeting. The high school auditorium was packed with over 1,000 people. David and Victoria were given front row seats, though David would have preferred to sit in the back. The mayor, Richard Torres, looked uncomfortable as he took the stage. "I've called this meeting to address the serious incident that occurred this weekend and to discuss our community's path forward regarding police accountability." Before he could continue, someone from the audience shouted, "This wasn't an incident. It was racial profiling. Say it." The crowd erupted in agreement. Mayor Torres held up his hands. "You're right. What happened to David Williams was racial profiling, and it's unacceptable." David was invited to speak. He walked up to the microphone, his legs feeling shaky but his resolve firm. "I'm not here to bash all police officers. I know many good officers who serve with honor and integrity. But I'm here to tell you that one bad officer with a badge and a gun can destroy lives. Officer Hayes didn't just pull me over. He humiliated me. He violated my rights. He treated me like a criminal in front of my neighbors and my community. And according to the reports, I'm not the first." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "The question we need to ask is, how many complaints does an officer need before something is done? How many people need to be profiled, harassed, and humiliated before the system takes action?" 14 complaints were filed against Officer Hayes over 20 years. 14 opportunities to intervene, to retrain, to discipline, but nothing happened until there were cameras everywhere and it became a PR problem. The crowd gave him a standing ovation. Several people were crying. A woman shouted, "Thank you for speaking up." Captain Rodriguez spoke next, and she looked genuinely troubled. "As the captain of this department, I take responsibility for what happened. We failed, Mr. Williams. We failed everyone who filed complaints that weren't taken seriously. We failed the community. But failure is only permanent if we don't learn from it and change." She outlined a series of reforms the department was implementing. Mandatory bias training, body cameras for all officers, a civilian review board with real authority, and a complete overhaul of the complaint investigation process. No more complaints falling through the cracks, she promised. No more officers with patterns of misconduct being allowed to continue without intervention. It sounded good, but David had heard promises before. He'd seen reform initiatives that faded once the public attention moved on to the next issue. Real change would require sustained pressure and accountability. Robert Chen, the lawyer who'd offered to help, stood up and announced that he was filing a class action lawsuit on behalf of everyone who'd been illegally stopped by Officer Hayes. If you were profiled by this officer, we want to hear from you. It's time for accountability, not just for one incident, but for years of civil rights violations. By the end of the week, over 30 people had come forward with their own stories about Hayes. A pattern emerged. He routinely pulled over black drivers in wealthy neighborhoods, often claiming they looked out of place or suspicious. He'd search cars without consent. He'd threaten arrests when people asserted their rights. And every time his reports made it sound like he'd conducted a routine, justified stop. The local newspaper ran a front-page investigation titled "The Pattern We Ignored." It detailed every complaint against Hayes, every dismissal, every time the system had chosen to believe the officer over the community members who'd tried to sound the alarm. David's dealership became an unofficial headquarters for the growing movement. People gathered there to share stories, organize protests, and plan strategy. Victoria set up a legal defense fund to help people who couldn't afford attorneys. The dealership's conference room was often full of community activists, lawyers, and victims of police misconduct all working together. But the attention took its toll. David's 13-year-old son came home from school crying one day because some kids had said his dad was a troublemaker who was making up the whole thing to get attention. His 15-year-old daughter was afraid to drive anywhere because she didn't want to be pulled over like her father. His 11-year-old asked him why that police officer hated them. Those conversations with his children were harder than anything else. Explaining racism to young people who were just beginning to understand the world's complexities, trying to reassure them while also preparing them for the reality of being black in America. It was exhausting. Victoria found David late one night in his home office, staring at his computer screen. "You should come to bed," she said gently. "I'm reading through all these stories people have sent," he replied. "Victoria, it's heartbreaking. So many people have been through similar experiences, some even worse, and most of them never had anyone believe them." She sat down next to him. "That's why what you're doing matters. You're giving them a voice. You're showing them they weren't crazy, they weren't imagining it, and they weren't alone." "I just wanted to drive home," David said quietly. "That's all. Just drive home on a Sunday afternoon. And now my whole life has become about this, I know. But you have a choice now. You can let this consume you, or you can channel it into something meaningful. You can help make sure this doesn't happen to someone else's son or daughter." David nodded slowly. She was right. This wasn't just about his experience anymore. It was bigger than that. And he had the platform, resources, and support to actually do something about it. The next morning, David announced the formation of a new nonprofit organization, the Fair Treatment Initiative. Its mission would be to provide legal support for victims of police misconduct, to advocate for policy changes, and to document incidents of racial profiling throughout the state. He was donating a substantial amount of his own money to get it started, and community donations were already pouring in. Officer Hayes stood there, trapped between his pride and reality. Anthony Chen wasn't backing down, and the crowd was getting more vocal by the minute. News reporters were setting up for live broadcasts. This situation was spiraling completely out of Hayes' control, but he seemed unable or unwilling to see it. "I'm conducting a legitimate investigation," Hayes said, his voice rising, "and I don't need a lawyer telling me how to do my job." "Actually, you do need a lawyer telling you about the constitutional rights you're violating," Anthony replied calmly. "But if you'd prefer, we can let a judge explain it to you tomorrow morning when I file for an emergency hearing." Victoria had her phone out again, and this time she wasn't calling their lawyer. She was calling someone else, speaking quickly in a low voice. "James, it's Victoria. I need you to come to Maple Street right now. Bring everyone you can from the dealership. And bring documentation. Everything. Yes, it's urgent. Hayes noticed the call but was too focused on his standoff with Anthony to pay much attention. That would turn out to be a mistake. David looked at his car, his belongings still scattered across the street like trash. His business cards were lying in the gutter. The birthday present for his daughter had been opened and tossed aside. His gym bag contents were strewn everywhere. This wasn't just about being pulled over anymore. This was about dignity, about being treated like a human being, about the assumption that he must be a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. A local news reporter, a woman named Jennifer Park, approached with her cameraman. "Mr. Williams, can we get a statement from you about what's happening here?" Anthony started to say no, but David shook his head. "Actually, I want to speak." He looked directly at the camera. "My name is David Williams. I'm a business owner in this city. I pay my taxes. I employ over 100 people. I've never been arrested, never been in trouble with the law. Today I was pulled over for no reason, accused of stealing my own car, had my vehicle illegally searched, and have been detained for over an hour with no charges filed against me. This is what racial profiling looks like. This is what it feels like to be guilty until proven innocent." The reporter turned to Officer Hayes. "Officer, would you like to respond to those allegations?" Hayes's face reddened. "This is an ongoing investigation. I have no comment. Can you tell us what prompted this traffic stop?" "No comment." "Did Mr. Williams commit a traffic violation?" "I said no comment," Hayes snapped, and the reporter took a step back. More cars were pulling up now. David recognized the vehicles immediately. They were from his dealership, all with the Williams Premium Auto Group logos on them. His general manager, James Park, got out of the first car, followed by 6 employees in their dealership uniforms. James took in the scene quickly, his expression shifting from confusion to anger. "What on earth is going on here?" Victoria rushed over to him. Officer Hayes accused David of stealing his car. He won't believe David owns it or the dealership. James turned to Hayes with disbelief written all across his face. "Are you kidding me? David Williams? You think he stole a car?" "And who are you?" Hayes demanded. "I'm James Park, general manager of Williams Premium Auto Group. This man," he pointed at David, "is my boss. He's the owner. He's the founder. He built this company from nothing." One of the employees, a young woman named Lisa, stepped forward holding a tablet. "I have our complete inventory records, sales records, and registration documents for this specific vehicle. It was purchased by Mr. Williams 3 weeks ago. I processed the paperwork myself." Another employee pulled out his phone, showing Hayes the dealership website. "Look, that's Mr. Williams right here on the homepage. That's him at our grand opening last year. That's him at the charity event we sponsored. There are hundreds of photos." Hayes looked at all of this evidence with growing discomfort, but he still wasn't ready to admit defeat. "Websites can be faked. Documents can be forged. For all I know, you're all part of this scheme." James actually laughed in astonishment. "Part of what scheme? What possible scheme involves owning 3 successful car dealerships? That's not a scam, officer. That's called being a successful businessman." "You're telling me that all of you work for him?" Hayes said, gesturing at David. "Yes, we all work for him. Some of us have been with him for over 10 years, Lisa said, her voice rising with frustration. Officer Rodriguez came over and quietly looked at the website on the employee's phone. He scrolled through photos, articles about the business, community awards David had won. Then he walked over to Hayes and said very quietly, "We need to end this, right now." But Hayes was like a dog with a bone. He couldn't let go. "I still need to verify all of this information." "Verify it how?" Anthony demanded. "These people have brought you documentation, proof of employment, business records. The vehicle registration matches. The license matches. What more do you need? A personal letter from the governor?" The sergeant, who'd been watching this whole disaster unfold, finally put her foot down. "Hayes, that's enough. This stop is over. I'm the primary officer here, and I say, I'm pulling rank," the sergeant said firmly. "This stop is terminated. Mr. and Mrs. Williams, you're free to go. We apologize for the inconvenience, but Hayes couldn't let it end that way." "You're making a mistake, Sergeant. Something isn't right here. I can feel it. The only mistake being made here is continuing this stop," she replied. "Mr. Williams, please collect your belongings. Officers, help him pick up his things." Officer Rodriguez immediately started gathering David's scattered items, looking genuinely apologetic as he did so. The third officer helped too. But Hayes just stood there, arms crossed, refusing to participate. As David and his employees picked up his belongings and put them back in his car, James made another call. "Captain Rodriguez?" "Yes, it's James Park from Williams Premium Auto. I need to report an incident involving one of your officers. It's serious. We have dozens of witnesses and multiple videos." "Yes, I'll hold." Hayes's eyes widened as he realized James was calling his superior. "You don't need to involve the captain." "Oh, I absolutely do need to involve the captain," James said, "because what happened here today is unacceptable, and it needs to be documented at the highest level." The crowd was still watching, still recording. News vans from 3 different stations were now on scene. Social media had picked up the story, and it was spreading fast. Local activists had started arriving, including the head of the local NAACP chapter. Victoria stood next to David, helping him put his things back in order. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this," she said quietly. "I'm not the first, and I won't be the last," David replied, his voice tired. "But maybe, just maybe, having all these witnesses and cameras will finally make people believe that this happens, that it's real." The sergeant approached them. "Mr. and Mrs. Williams, again, I apologize for this situation. I'm going to make sure a full report is filed." "With all due respect, Sergeant, reports get filed all the time and nothing changes," David said. But this time everyone saw it. Everyone recorded it. This time there's no denying what happened. Captain Rodriguez was on her way. The news was spreading, and Officer Hayes was about to learn that pulling over the wrong person on the wrong day in front of the wrong crowd could change everything. 3 months after that Sunday afternoon traffic stop, David sat in a conference room at City Hall. The police disciplinary board had finally reached their decision about Officer Hayes. The room was packed with community members, reporters, lawyers, and several of Hayes's former victims who'd found the courage to come forward. The board chair, a retired judge named Patricia Henderson, read the findings in a clear, firm voice. After a thorough investigation into the conduct of Officer Derek Hayes, including review of 14 formal complaints, 37 witness statements, body camera footage, and dash cam recordings, this board finds that Officer Hayes engaged in a pattern of racial profiling that violated department policy and the constitutional rights of numerous citizens. David felt Victoria squeeze his hand. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. Judge Henderson continued. Officer Hayes demonstrated a consistent pattern of stopping black drivers without reasonable suspicion, conducting illegal searches, and filing reports that misrepresented the facts of these encounters. His conduct has brought disrepute to the department and eroded community trust. Therefore, this board unanimously recommends termination of employment. The room erupted in applause and cheers. Several people were crying with relief. Robert Chen, who'd organized many of Hayes's victims, hugged his wife. The young mother, Lisa, who'd been one of the first to defend David at the scene, was openly weeping. Hayes, who'd sat through the entire hearing with his lawyer, stood up quickly and left the room without comment. His 20-year career was over, ended not by retirement or honor, but by accountability that had come too late for too many people. But David knew the termination was only one piece of justice. The real question was whether anything would actually change. Captain Rodriguez approached David after the hearing. "I know this doesn't undo what happened to you or to anyone else he harmed, but I hope it sends a message that we're serious about accountability." "It's a start," David acknowledged. "But Captain, one officer being fired isn't enough. We need systemic change." "I agree, and we're working on it." She showed him a thick binder. "These are the new policies we're implementing. Mandatory de-escalation training, implicit bias workshops, a requirement that officers document specific, articulable facts for every stop, and a civilian oversight board with real authority to investigate complaints." David flipped through the binder, reading the detailed policies. They were more comprehensive than he'd expected. "Who wrote these?" "A task force made up of officers, community members, civil rights lawyers, and yes, victims of police misconduct. We wanted to make sure we were listening to the people most affected by these issues." It was progress, real meaningful progress, but David had learned that progress required constant vigilance. The civil rights lawsuit that Robert Chen had filed was settled 2 weeks later. The city agreed to pay $3 million to be distributed among Hayes's victims. But more importantly, they agreed to continue the reforms, to publish quarterly reports on traffic stops broken down by race, and to maintain the Civilian Oversight Board permanently. David used his portion of the settlement to fully fund the Fair Treatment Initiative. The organization had grown beyond his wildest expectations. They had 5 full-time staff members, including 2 lawyers who provided free legal representation to victims of police misconduct. They'd successfully advocated for similar reforms in 3 neighboring cities, and they'd documented over 200 incidents of potential racial profiling in the past 90 days alone. The dealership was thriving too. David had worried that the controversy might hurt business, but the opposite had happened. People respected him for standing up, for fighting back, for turning his trauma into action. Sales were up 30%, and he'd hired 20 new employees to handle the increased demand. But the most meaningful change wasn't in the numbers or the policies. It was in the conversations happening throughout the community. Parents were talking to their kids about racial profiling and civil rights. Teachers were discussing the incident in classrooms. Church groups and community organizations were hosting forums on police accountability. The story had sparked something deeper than just one man's vindication. 6 months after the traffic stop, David was invited to testify before the state legislature about police reform. He stood in the Capitol building, looking out at rows of elected officials who had the power to change laws throughout the entire state. Members of the legislature, he began, "I'm not here as a victim. I'm here as a citizen who believes we can do better. When I was pulled over 6 months ago, I had resources that most people don't. I had a lawyer who could arrive quickly. I had employees who came to support me. I had community connections that gave me credibility. But what about the people who don't have those advantages? What about the young person who doesn't have a lawyer on speed dial? What about the immigrant who's afraid to assert their rights? What about everyone who's been through this but never had anyone believe them?" He paused, making eye contact with several legislators. "I'm asking you to pass the Police Accountability and Transparency Act. Require body cameras statewide. Create a database of officer complaints that follows them from department to department. Make bias training mandatory and ongoing. Give communities a real voice in oversight. Because what happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone, and the only way to ensure it doesn't is through systemic change backed by law." The committee voted to advance the bill. It wasn't passed yet, but it was moving forward. Change was slow, but it was happening. David's story had become part of a larger narrative about race, justice, and accountability in America. He'd been interviewed by national news programs, had spoken at civil rights conferences, and had become an unexpected voice in the reform movement. It wasn't a role he'd sought, but it was one he'd embraced because it mattered. One evening, David returned to Maple Street, the location where he'd been pulled over. He parked his car in almost the same spot and just sat there for a moment, remembering. The fear, the anger, the humiliation, but also the community support, the determination to fight back, and the changes that had followed. A police car drove by slowly, and David tensed instinctively. But the officer inside waved and kept driving. It was Officer Rodriguez, the young cop who'd been at the original scene and had promised to do better. He'd become one of the department's most vocal advocates for reform, training other officers on bias awareness and de-escalation. Victoria pulled up next to him. They'd planned to meet here, to reclaim this space that had once felt so hostile. They got out of their cars and stood together on the sidewalk. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Honestly, still processing. This spot used to just be a street. Now it's a symbol of something bigger, a reminder of how far we've come and how far we still have to go." They walked hand in hand down the sidewalk, past the houses where neighbors had come out to witness the incident, past the spots where news cameras had set up, past the place where David's belongings had been scattered on the ground. "You know what's strange?" David said. "Sometimes I'm grateful it happened." Victoria looked at him in surprise. "Grateful? Not for the experience itself. That was traumatic and I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but grateful that it happened to me. Someone with the resources to fight back. Grateful that it was recorded. Grateful that it led to changes that will protect other people. If it had to happen to someone, I'm glad I was in a position to do something about it." A year after the incident, David stood in the newly opened Community Justice Center, a facility that housed the Fair Treatment Initiative, a legal aid clinic, and spaces for community organizing. The building had been funded partly by the settlement money, partly by community donations, and partly by a grant from a national civil rights organization. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, David looked out at the crowd. There were faces he recognized from that Sunday afternoon. The people who'd recorded the incident, the neighbors who'd spoken up, his employees who'd rushed to his defense. There were also new faces, young activists, concerned citizens, and people who'd found their own courage to fight injustice after seeing David fight his. "This center represents hope," David said in his speech. "Hope that when injustice happens, we don't have to accept it. Hope that communities can come together to demand change. Hope that the system, as broken as it sometimes is, can be reformed if we're willing to do the hard work." His children were in the front row, older now and more aware of the complexities of the world. His son had started a student group at his high school focused on civil rights education. His daughter volunteered at the center on weekends, helping families navigate the legal system. Even his youngest had become an advocate, giving a speech at her school about treating everyone fairly regardless of what they looked like. David thought about Officer Hayes sometimes, wondering what he was doing now, whether he'd learned anything from being held accountable. But mostly, David thought about the future, about the young black kid who might drive through an upscale neighborhood someday and not be pulled over simply for existing, about the mother who wouldn't have to teach her son how to interact with police during traffic stops because those stops would be based on actual violations, not skin color.